Hi, today we're going to be talking about Shakespeare's use of rhetoric, specifically rhetorical devices. You may have worked with ethos, pathos, and logos in high school. I did not, so this is not something that I learned a ton of until I went to grad school for Shakespeare, and one of my professors was very, very into rhetoric, and so we learned a lot. Today I'm going to be sharing about 10 terms, sort of specific rhetorical devices with you, but I want you to know that my hope for you with this lecture is for you to start thinking about the ways in which you're seeing Shakespeare use language in the plays that you read, not forcing you to memorize a whole list of Greek. That's not my goal here. If you're like, oh, I'm so sorry we're not learning more Greek, and would love to learn more rhetorical terms, this is Latham's Handbook of Rhetorical Terms. It has over 1,000. You can learn them all and see how many have parallels or like overlaps or whatnot, if you like that. Sister Miriam Joseph's Shakespeare's Use of the Arts of Language is another book that talks about sort of how these are put into practice. Not all of it's about rhetoric, but often it is. And then the number one book I recommend if you're interested in this stuff does not use this specific terminology. In fact, specifically rejects it, but it is Scott Kaiser's Shakespeare's Wordcraft. This book is phenomenal. Scott Kaiser is the text coach at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival, so he works with actors, and this book is meant to be very easy to read and easy to follow along, but goes through all sorts of the ways in which Shakespeare uses language in innovative and exciting ways. So there's a whole section on how Shakespeare uses words in particular, the sounds of the words, making up his own words. I think we've talked a little bit in class about Shakespeare producing a lot of the words in the English language. And the way he did that was not by just like imagining a new word and then creating it. Sometimes words get made up sort of out of the blue, but normally Shakespeare making up words is the way new words are made up today. So, for example, a new word in 2020 was doom scrolling. It's like two words put together. Everybody knows what it is, and it is a popular word because it's emblematic of what a lot of people are feeling. There are some rhetorical terms. Here we go. Okay, the first several are going to be about repetition. So, anaphora is a rhetorical term that means a repetition of the beginnings of phrases. This can be a single word or a whole phrase. So in Twelfth Night, when Orsino says, one face, one voice, one habit, and two persons, all that one face, one voice, one habit is the repetition of the initial word, right? This is really popular in speeches. MLK's I have a dream. Any creed in a church, I believe, blank. I believe, and then fill in the blank. That's one way of creating emphasis and often building. Epiphoria is the same thing, except instead of a repetition of the beginning of the phrases, it's a repetition at the end of the phrases. So there's one in Henry IV Part 1. Hotspur is talking about how much he wanted to talk with the king about Mortimer, but the king didn't want to talk about Mortimer, so he said he would not ransom Mortimer, forbade my tongue to speak of Mortimer, but I will find him when he lies asleep, and in his ear I'll holler, Mortimer! Nay, I'll have a starling, shall be taught to speak, and nothing but Mortimer, and give it to him, and keep his anger still in motion. So again, we get this Mortimer, 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 and like it even becomes sort of like sing-songy and becomes about a bird, like screeching the name incessantly. This also gets used in speeches. Aragorn's speech to his troops in the Return of the King. Like this is the sort of thing like rallies people together, or in the case of Hotspur, just sort of vents some anger. Another repetitive rhetorical device is epizeuxis, which is the best word to say in your mouth. Epizeuxis. That's when you're repeating a single word without any words in between. Very, very much. Or Juliet says, sweet, sweet, sweet nurse. I feel like another place where this comes up is with emojis. If you just put a heart emoji or a smiley face emoji, that means one thing, but if you put like 10 hearts, that means something different. And I think epizeuxis is sort of doing the same thing here. And another repetition rhetorical devices. There are lots more that have to do with repetition, but last one I'm going to share is chiasmus, which is Greek letter chi is like an X. So when we were memorizing these, one of my colleagues had a 3-year-old son named Dylan, a very large dog. And her example of the chiasmus that she wrote was, when Dylan walks the dog, the dog walks Dylan. So how it works is like Kai is like when Dylan walks the dog walks Dylan. So the two pieces get repeated a second time each, but they get repeated in the opposite order. So Dylan, dog, dog, Dylan. This is true in a lot of places in Shakespeare too. The witches say fair is foul and foul is fair. So those are repetition ones. That was anaphora, which is repetitions of the beginnings. Epiphoria, which is repetitions of the endings. Epizeuxis, which is just repetition of a single word with nothing in between. And then chiasmus, which is the X shape. Another example of a category is substitutions. There's lots of rhetorical devices that have to do with substitutions. My favorite of the substitution ones is where you substitute a word for a different part of speech. So instead of using a verb as a verb and a noun as a noun, you use a noun as a verb or use a verb as a noun. Shakespeare's like smartest characters do this a lot. We mentioned, I think, early in this class, Cleopatra will do this. One example is she says, "He words me, girls, he words me," and she's using the word words to sort of signify, like, words as a noun, right? Like, wording is not an action one takes most of the time. She's using that noun as a verb, throwing words at me. But instead of saying throwing words at, she says, "He words me." Sort of the opposite of that, Acrologia, also known as malaprops, is when you're substituting just the wrong word. You mean one thing, but you accidentally say the different thing. So Dogberry has a lot of these. There's a lot of characters, often clown characters, who misspeak in Shakespeare. So one example for Dogberry is, "Oh, villain, thou wilt be condemned into everlasting redemption for this." And of course he doesn't mean redemption, he means like damnation or condemnation or like not, "You will go to heaven for this for sure." It's like definitely the opposite. Another substitution one is Epinorthesis, when someone corrects oneself sort of mid-speech. This is something that happens all the time in regular conversation, but in Shakespeare, if you're writing something out, you can just make sure they say it right the first time. So if a character is correcting themselves, that probably is showing something about their state of mind, right? So Hamlet says, "But 2 months dead, nay, not so much, not 2. The last one of the substitutions, this is Synecdoche, where instead of saying the whole thing, you use a part of the whole. So if someone is asking for, "Here to ask for your daughter's hand," you mean you want to marry her whole person. You don't just want to marry her hand, right? Like, but the hand is sort of standing in for the whole. This comes up in Shakespeare a lot, often with like body parts that have to do with the senses. So the hand or the eye or the ear. The ghost says in Hamlet, "The whole ear of Denmark is by a forged process of my death rankly abused." So he's saying that Denmark has been lied to. Their ears have been abused. But he doesn't mean just their ears. Like, all of Denmark is abused by the lies that are being spread. And then the last two that I have are one is very broad and one is very specific. Antithesis is a contrast or juxtaposition. This is one you will find everywhere in Shakespeare. He does this all the time. One example I'm going to share is from Macbeth, where Lady Macbeth says, "Look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." So she's making a contrast. Apostrophe sounds like the punctuation mark, but apostrophe is when someone is speaking to something other than a character or the audience. It's a poetic device. It's not like people were running around in early modern England doing this per se. It's just that it's a common thing in drama. Macbeth, when he's talking about seeing a dagger, he says, "Is this a dagger I see before me? The handle towards my hand." And then he starts talking to the dagger. He says, "Come, let me clutch thee." And so, like, suddenly he's stopped from talking to the audience about, "Oh, look, I see a dagger." He's starting to say, like, "Hello, dagger, let me hold you," which is sort of a different thing. Often they're an idea, right? Viola says, "Disguise, thou art a wickedness." So she's talking to her own disguise as a man, right? She didn't mean to have Olivia fall in love with her with this disguise, and now everyone's going to be sad, but when she says disguise, thou art a wickedness, she's addressing disguise as though disguise is another character. So I don't want you to memorize all these devices, but if you do start thinking about where is there repetition, where is there substitution, and where are things being addressed or contrasted in unusual ways, I think that'll bring a lot to your reading of these texts. So yeah, happy reading. Bye!